Hi, I'm Jawara Alleyne and I'm a fashion designer.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Jones-Henry and I'm a writer and strategist. And today we're going to be talking about all things culture and material innovation and sustainability. So Jawara, tell us about your last collection and all things New Worlds.
So my last collection, actually my last collection was Beach Business, the most recent one.
Yeah.
But the one before that, which led into Beach Business, was called The New World. Mm-hmm. And essentially it was this space of thinking about the way that history was taught in the Caribbean. When I was growing up, sort of studying social studies in school, the lens that we were always taught world history from was always from the point of the European sort of point of view on what it looked like to see the Caribbean as a space that has been developed. I always remembered this point of reference of understanding and learning about my own history through the lens of this historical moment that happened within the Caribbean, which was the discovery of the New World, where Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean. We all know the story. So the New Worlds collection that was my last collection at Fashion East, and I thought it was really important for me to sort of set a precedence for how stories are told, who gets to tell stories about themselves. So that collection was kind of pulling in on that sort of point of view of placing myself back at the forefront of that narrative and looking at the New World, which is the story that we know with a different point of view, like really placing the stamp on those three words, the New World, but saying that actually there are other stories that can be told within this than the way that we normally tell stories. And I remember like growing up within the Caribbean, there was always this conversations, like new information coming in. And it was always like, oh, we're not going to change the books because it's just too expensive. Like, we know that this is not necessarily true, but, we're just not going to change the books because it's just too much of a hassle to do it. So we're just going to continue teaching history the way that it's always been taught. So myself being a person who is now sort of able to tell my own story and write a new cultural narrative, I think it was really important for me to take that collection and that moment to sort of set a precedence for how I want to tell stories, what lens I would be telling stories from, how I want to sort of weave these narratives of where I'm from and the way that I've sort of developed culturally within the world, placing that at the forefront of my work. And then that led into Beach Business, which was a collection that was looking at fashion within the islands. So I went back to the Cayman Islands in the summer of last year. And it was really sort of a great moment of sort of returning to that space that I actually started doing fashion from. And I was looking at the streetwear, the development of streetwear on island, and what sort of the presentation of luxury through the way that Black Caribbean women dress within the church, within just society in general, what that looked like. But most importantly, I was looking at the way that the corporate space asks you on a super hot island to dress. And what was really interesting is like you would go to these resorts and you see these bellboys who are just like totally not dressed for the weather. You're in a 3-piece suit, full wool on the beach. Like this sort of space of like seeing this mismatch of like something that clearly doesn't make sense within that space, but it just happens to be like that because that's the way that we've designed the identity of this person to be. I was really looking at sort of breaking down what it looks like to do business on a beach, what clothes look like to do business on a beach. And yeah, this collection, I think the New World really was quite important for me to start thinking about the way that I approach my research and the way that I approach fashion, and also the way that this point of view, what this means actually on a global scale. Because a lot of what happens within the islands is not just contained within the islands. A lot of what happens to us happens because of sort of outside influences and outside stories, outside narratives that have been placed upon us. Therefore, we think about ourselves in a specific kind of way.
Well, the powers that be definitely know why they put us together, because the thing about storytelling and identity and the islands is actually how I ended up wanting to be a journalist, because I don't know, we'll cover which parts of the Caribbean you're from, but my grandparents are Windrush, and I grew up hearing all the stories about our culture and identity, but not seeing any of it in the books at school. There's a footnote about Windrush and a little bit about World War II and slavery, and that's it at the end. So the desire to want to take hold of the pen, because who has the pen and writes history, definitely is probably why I'm sat here with you today. But I'm from Jamaica. My grandparents are from Jamaica and Cuba, and my mother's side primarily are from Mandeville, and they're also Arawak and Taino, the indigenous. So this interest of wanting to write our history back in, and the fact that you reference Columbus, you know, that is, you know, his first stop was Jamaica. People don't realize that.
Right.
So we've actually endured that violence of having our story ripped from us, probably more than most, I think. And I think it's fascinating that that was your call to action too. So yeah, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about specifically where in the Caribbean you're from and what your experience of the different islands and vibrations are. I'd love to hear that.
So I was born in Jamaica. I grew up in Jamaica. I left Jamaica when I was 12.
Right.
12/13. I moved to the Cayman Islands. We had a huge hurricane that destroyed the island, and I moved back to Jamaica for 1 year, then back to Cayman. So I growing up within Jamaica was very interesting, specifically as a person that was always quite creative. It was always a space where I was forced to see myself as different from the people around me, creatively, but also just the fact that actually I was always in neighborhoods that people didn't always look like me. Like my family didn't all look the same.
Same.
People, it's just this kind of experience growing up in Jamaica. It's such a mixed experience from all levels of what that could mean, because our identities are mixed, our heritage is mixed,
everything.
Our communities are mixed,
Our food,
our food is mixed. You know, you have all of these influences that are coming from all over the world. That has sort of defined what our identity means, and then we've taken that and created something of our own. But there's so much within what it means to be Jamaican that is picking up from the histories of the Spanish on island, the histories of the Portuguese, the histories of the British on island. So growing up in Jamaica, I think it was really an enriching experience, especially growing up in Mandeville, which is not a main city. I always thought that it was a city when I was growing up, because like, we have everything. What are you
We
talking
all
about?
did. And can I just say, we're from the same county. So I think there is some bias there, but we're the best. It's okay.
I was always like, you know, it's great to be here. Like you're on this sort of beautiful mountainside, and you're engulfed within forests and sort of these spaces that are natural. Like my grandmother grew everything in the backyard, and then we had a common next door, and like there was this community that really pulled in from the land. And what's interesting about Jamaica as well is that the Tainos called it the land of wood and water.
Yes, we did.
It is this really mystical place that really forces you to live with the land, because the land is just so enriching that like it is kind of what the space offers. So growing up within that space of like really living on the land and everything is grown in your backyard was really important for my development of what I saw to be my own identity and what it means to actually live in the world. Moving to Cayman, though, was a very different experience, because we didn't have land like we do in Jamaica. We don't have agriculture like we do in Jamaica. A lot of what we consume is imported, and business looks very different within these two islands. But it was in Cayman that I really sort of developed an interest in the world and what was happening outside, because in Cayman I was also, again, othered, once again, moving to this new country where now, you're an outsider yet again. But what's interesting about Cayman is that at that time there was a lot, I mean, still there's a lot of expats coming in and, you know, the radio stations are not, in Jamaica, the radio stations are Jamaican music for the most part.
RJR.
You would get pop culture, you
Yeah.
would get Janet Jackson, you would get like the big guys, but it's predominantly Jamaican culture is really contained, and also rightly so. It's such an incredible exploration of self. Whereas in Cayman, you get a lot of influences from what's going on in the outside world. So I started listening to a lot of rock. I worked in this bookshop that was always playing like blues and always playing jazz and always playing country. Cayman is a
country western.
Country western. They love country. They love country. So I think in all of these stages in my life, I was having sort of growing up within a space that like really forced me to think about my own identity from when I was a child and really grounding myself in what it meant to be myself, to be Caribbean, to be Black, to be Jamaican. And really holding that true and then moving into these spaces that constantly reminds you that you're not the only one in the room, that there's all these additional influences that are, you know, happening. I think it was quite valuable to exist within these two places because they're both so different from each other as well.
Well, I love listening to you because obviously I'm born in London. I'm a fourth generation Londoner. So I come at my heritage via what I hear from my grandparents. And obviously I go back every Christmas, but I'm going back really as a tourist. And as you probably well know, Jamaicans are quite insular. So they'll say, you're not Jamaican, you're English. So I think it's interesting to your experience in the Caymans, how you were able to bring in the musical diversity as part of your self-exploration. And I think that music is a part of our DNA, the sound design, soundscape. So I'm interested because we obviously we're here to talk about sustainability, and I'll be really transparent. My root in sustainability came from my granddad, who's the Taino in Arawak. And he always taught me that we are put on this earth to be custodians, nothing is ours, and we should leave it in a better condition than we found it. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, in the world that I inhabit in journalism and in the arts, if there is a person of colour or a Black person in the room, they tended not to be from the Caribbean, they tended to be from West Africa. And that's not a critique, it's just an observation that the voice of the diaspora is much more diverse, I think, than people realise. So I'd be interested to know how, in your practice, sustainability manifests, and if you even call it that, because I never really called it that, it was just common sense and just having values, really. But I'd be interested to know how you've woven that into the tapestry of what you do.
So I've always kind of been sustainable by nature. I think just the way that I grew up and my interest in sort of starting out in fashion, you know, learning to sew at home, just like mending, all the stuff that you have. My interest in sustainability kind of came naturally. So when I moved to London and everyone started talking about sustainable fashion, I was like, what are you guys talking about? This is just like,
the baseline.
This is just what we do. This is just how you should approach just life. I think now I talk less about sustainability and more just about circularity, because I think that is a concept that actually makes sense to think about. Like sustainability is such a broad and ambiguous topic. I was talking a couple of days ago at this STEM talk. I was giving a presentation about sustainability, and what's interesting is how, because it's such a huge topic, and you place this in front of like kids and they have no idea. I think the kids nowadays, they're actually a little bit more clued up, but I tutor at Central St. Martin's, and I always see this thing where whenever we get to that space of talking about sustainability, they kind of like freeze. So they kind of don't really know what you mean and how to really even deconstruct what that actually means. So a lot of times where I find myself now is talking a lot more about circularity, because I think that is a point of view that makes a little bit more sense and it's a little bit more accessible. In my own work, I think I've built 3 pillars of sustainability into the way that I think about fashion. There's drape work, there's cut work, and there's handwork. So drape work for me is this theory that looks at cultures that have found a way to make garments out of just wrapping things around themselves. And I think you will see that there's many cultures, African cultures, Caribbean cultures, Indian cultures, Asian cultures that have this relationship with fabric where the fabric is quite precious and you don't really, it's not about cutting into it and creating patterns. It's about having a relationship with fabric that allows you to just wrap something around yourself. And actually that is exactly what you need. So drapework came out of this theory of looking at this way of thinking about clothes. And the way that I use that within my work is we always design with zero waste patterns. So a lot of our patterns are made with squares that reduces the waste. And when I started my research coming out of Central St. Martin's, I was looking at how I could find a way to produce and create fashion that reduced as much time in between step of like cutting and sewing, which increases so much waste, potential for waste. So this was a way for me to figure out how to like make stuff for photo shoots, for instance, that didn't really rely on spending so much time on cutting and sewing, but instead it was about me actually being on set and wrapping this person, draping this person to create that moment of beauty. And then at the end of the shoot, we just take it all down and the fabric still remains. So that's one approach that I included within my research. The next one is cut work. And that comes from a theory of deconstruction. When I was coming up within the space of fashion, looking at what kind of movements of fashion I was really interested in, anti-fashion was always the one that was like at the forefront of that space of interest for me. So thinking about like the punk movement, designers like Raquel Kubo, Helmut Lang, Margiela, like they've all explored and sort of included deconstruction as a way of thinking about how to create fashion that is not from an industrialized point of view. So with the Cutwork project within my brand, what I do is I rework a lot of garments. I'm really just thinking about ways of using the theory of cutting. I also trained as for a really long time as a sample cutter. So it also kind of came out of that theory of like one is knowledge of the fabric, one is knowledge of the scissor. So thinking of ways of having a base as a starting point and removing and adding onto that thing that have already existed before to give it a new sense of life. So that's the Cutwork part of my design approach. And then the other is handwork, which is more of a social way of thinking about sustainability, where I'm really interested in ways that you can create fashion that's actually made by hand and not industrialized. So thinking about crafts like crochet, for instance, like we work with this collective of Syrian refugees who are artisans in the craft of crochet, and working with them to try and, on one side, allow them to build a community and an economy around their skills. But also building that in as a practice of a way of thinking about producing fashion that goes outside of the regular cut and sew way of thinking about fashion, which eventually produces so much waste.
That is a beautiful way to thread into my next question, because I'm really interested in regenerative culture, full stop, not just regenerative materials or design, because to your point about the Taino name for Jamaica, wood and water, my interest in fashion was also about the human impact and the human impact on the soil. And I know that you probably know already the stats of what water waste and the toxins and that consciousness of, as I said, it's meant to be sacred, right? Well, what are we doing to the environment? So when you speak of the hand as a pillar, this reconnecting fashion back to the humanity of it and the community that comes with it, because also when we're sat around a table crocheting, we're talking, we're sharing, and it brings it back to the storytelling. So I'd be interested to know what your take is on the material innovation aspect, because obviously innovation always kind of goes side by side with industrialization. So how do you keep the innovation human? And just, I just want to know your views on the materiality side of things as well.
Materiality, I haven't really gotten into what the future of materials really look like right now, specifically because to be involved in that space of fashion, you actually need a lot of funding and investment, and
you do.
I don't.
You can look to the camera when you say that.
Yeah, I don't. No. It's like starting out a young brand, a sort of startup fashion project, let's say. For me, it's always important to first reject the things that you don't want and then figure out a way to create something that you do.
Yeah.
So where I am with sort of the development and the production of fashion is first and foremost figuring out the areas of fashion that I don't want to go down, or the ways that I need to find the right answer of what actually makes sense. A lot of what happens is that, you know, a young designer starts their brand, does very well. Immediately you need to think about sales.
Yeah.
So then you need to think about, okay, who's going to produce all these things?
Yeah.
Like it
Yeah.
moves at
Scaling
such a
production.
pace.
Yeah.
Scaling
Yeah.
production moves at such a pace that it makes it actually really difficult to think about these things as a brand. And then you just end up going for whatever is the quickest, cheapest, the most feasible, the most affordable. So my thing is like really taking that time to investigate and research into what kind of supply chain actually makes sense for the value systems that I want to build within the brand. As such, I think my way of thinking about materialism is always about craft. So I'm developing, I'm going to Japan in August to really sort of investigate and think. I think Japan is a place that has actually really developed an industry around craft and an industry around reworking and sustainable ways of producing. And that I'm really fascinated by, you know, indigenous ways of thinking. Because we talk about sustainability in fashion as if it's something that's really new, but, you know, there's so many indigenous cultures that have found...
They've been doing it for thousands of years.
they've been doing it. They've been doing it. So I think for me, it's really allowing those spaces where actually you can include those voices that have actually a history of using materials for eons. And finding a way to include those conversations in the building of industries.
Well, again, threading through beautifully, because my next question is on repair culture. And you've gone to Japan in reference, and I know they take another approach by even painting the cracks in gold, you know, trying to show that actually what we think or would normally throw away actually can be salvaged. But back to the Caribbean, because I think that repair culture is something that all of our grandmothers just did because it was the sensible thing to do with the biscuit tin and the sewing kit inside it. I'm interested in that because I still see that as a part of the material innovation conversation, because I don't think everything needs to be a new material.
Agreed.
I think to your point about indigenous knowledge, it's going back to relearn how to use what we already have. So to look back at your three pillars, I'm interested to know what your take is on the repair culture scene. And I don't want to call it a trend, because I think we've established this is a way of life. Trend. What are your thoughts on repair culture?
Well, essentially, repair culture has seeped its way into the cutwear project that I do. So I have this brand within my brand. It's a research project really called the Untitled Collection. And it's essentially stuff that I remake. A lot of what ends up in charity shops, if we're taking t-shirts, for instance, a lot of what ends up in charity shops are single-use t-shirts. And single-use t-shirts, I think, are one of the biggest items that's in the landfills because it's printed with a slogan that has a year that doesn't really relate to anything. So even if, yes, it goes into the charity shop, no one's really going to buy a thing with this random labeling. So one thing that I do, and really thinking about this culture that comes from a repair mindset, is taking these garments that has reached the end of their life cycle and giving them a new sense of value. So cutting out and then sewing back in or penning back in new motifs, new ways of thinking about how to give a garment a new sense of value. It's really that. It's really sort of the redefining and re-investigating a sense of value into items that have lost that sense of value.
That goes back circularity-wise to the beginning of why you even started, because I think it's interesting about narratives and storytelling and putting narratives back into places where they've been extracted, or putting value back into cultures that have been denigrated. So I'm interested, if we're looking at the future of conversation, which I always find quite difficult because who can predict the future, but if we could shape the future, not just in terms of materiality or the climate crisis or all the other crises that we're dealing with, what are your hot takes on what you'd like to see coming forwards in your field from your peers and yourself?
more investment in sort of diverse conversations, more investment in, I think just the fashion industry at large is one that heralds voices that looks the same as voices previously. And it sometimes has a problem with embracing new ways of thinking about culture, embracing new ways of thinking about ideation that isn't sensationalized. Because yes, you have the big brands that are appointing people like Pharrell and people like Future, et cetera, but this is a sensationalization of Black culture. It's a sensationalization of what it means to present something with a different point of view. And what would be interesting is to see spaces where a new story can actually come to the fore, where it's not just about sensationalizing myself. I think for me, coming from the Caribbean, and I don't think that the fashion that I create is sensationalized, such a hard word.
I know it is,
Sensationalizing my culture. It's really, how do I take these experiences that I've had actually to create something new, something that faces the future, something that's, some people might say it's Afrofuturistic or Carib futuristic or whatever, but it's really just taking these experiences and thinking about, okay, if we're looking into the future, how can what I've learned and what I've picked up along my journey actually say something to where we can go into the future, and figuring out a language that can come out of that does look like something new, does look like something that we haven't seen before. I wouldn't necessarily say that my fashion is Caribbean fashion. It's actually not. It's just the honesty of what comes out of me as an entity, as a being, as a human who have this background and come from these point of views that have given me spaces where this is what I consider to be valuable.
I think it's my grandmother told me, or my dad, it was a saying, I think, I don't know the past part of it, but essentially what's in you goes with you wherever you go. And I think it's interesting how you've taken that. As you say, you're not taking it as a tokenistic thing to say, I'm calling it Caribbean culture. You're saying, no, this is the essence of what I am. And it will feed its way through in different ways. But I think if I had to look at the future, the thing I'm most concerned about, I guess, which is where I come in with the work I do, it's the talent pipeline. Because to your point, there are gatekeepers in this industry and they have a preconceived idea of what certain boxes and certain talent should go into. And I think that needs to be redrafted and redrawn because, to your point, the diversity of voices is what it's all about. It's a storytelling exercise. You know, the craft is what is that person trying to say? So yeah, I think we're aligned on that one.
Yeah, I think what has happened, especially in the space of London, is like you had a history of really creative kids coming through, and you know, it's always been about being rebellious with ideation and being rebellious with the way that you can think about presenting fashion, like what constitutes as fashion, what needs to be at the forefront of these conversations. But due to, I guess, capitalism and probably multiplicities of other reasons, we found ourselves in a place where no one can really stand forward and say that this is what I think is actually good. This is who I think is actually carrying us into the future. It's always like you need like 10 other people to co-sign you, whether you're good or not, by committee, before you can even get to that. It's not about whether you're talented or not. It's not about whether you're presenting something that is at the forefront of what all of the conversations within fashion, diversity, sustainability, material futures. It's not about whether you're actually doing these things. It's about how much cosign can you get. And I think we also have found ourselves in this point because we're in this huge social media
echo chamber
revolution, if you want to call it, where in some instances, there's clear appointments where that is what really matters. Like, how does it look on social media? Not what is it really doing for the progressing of fashion.
I think that brings it back down really again to the beginning. It's about what is the authentic story that's being told. And I think you can't really combine industrialization with authenticity because by its nature, industrialization wants to homogenize and go for the lowest margin and the lowest and the lowest and the lowest. So I think that in a positive way, actually, I think we've almost had to go back to scratch to say, actually, no, let's just rewrite it. Let's just redraw it. And I think I'm very grateful to have had this conversation with you because it's encouraging to know and to see a manifestation that's happening in real time.
I think honesty is also really important. Like,
Yes.
all of the designers that you look back at, like if we talk about the heyday of design in the 90s when you had McQueen and Galliano.
And Westwood, Vivienne Westwood.
And Westwood, these people were so honest with the rawness that came forth and what they wanted to communicate. And I think that we really need to start actually valuing the honesty more. It's not just about ticking a box, but how can you present a story that is really genuine and honest and really, I think once you start being honest with yourself and presenting that, it really transcends. It really crosses boundaries and barriers, whether you're from this narrative or not. Like the honesty of your human experience is really what gets people.
Tell your story.